Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Bloc Party, titled Hymns. You know, if we were looking for a way to categorize indie music in the 2000s, especially the early to mid 2000s, it'd be this slew of acts that just blew the world wide open with borderline classic debut albums, and yet could never really recapture the magic throughout the course of the rest of the decade. Of course, that's all a matter of degree. As a fan of some of these acts, I actually thought they managed to follow it up halfway decently, but bands like The Killers or Franz Ferdinand or The Strokes or Interpol were never really able to capture that lightning in the bottle that was their debut, at least in the public eye. And in 2005, that band was Bloc Party. Now, I've gone back to re-listen to their debut album Silent Alarm a number of times, and it remains one of the best indie rock albums of the 2000s, easily, with a relentlessly tight construction, a fantastic sense of momentum, and lyrics that could actually match all that visceral tension. And then for the rest of the decade, Bloc Party couldn't seem to really match it, pivoting towards underwhelming but still pretty solid electronics for a weekend in the city to more riotously electronic intimacy, which I'd argue wasn't quite as consistently good, but it had stronger high points like the absolutely amazing Zephyrus. I think that's one of their best songs. So after that, they took 4 years off. Their frontman Kelly went and did a solo project. They came back with a return to their roots on 4 in 2012. And look, if they were trying to imitate Silent Alarm, it was not working. The heavier guitars didn't have the same sense of tightness or tempo or groove. The production was not as sharp, and it felt most like a band trying desperately to recapture what came naturally years earlier. But the roots of that might have actually run deeper. The band was quite unstable around that time, and both the drummer and bassist left the band in the following years, your entire rhythm section. Fortunately, they were able to pull together some new members, including Justin Harris of Menomina on bass, which is definitely a positive sign, but then the lead-off single The Love Within happened, and while you could see traces of what Bloc Party were trying to do in the multi-track vocals and the percussion, those blocky, oscillating keyboards just smothered any sort of tightness the song might have had, and sure as hell was not a replacement for any guitar work. In other words, I didn't know what to expect with this album. So, what did we get with Hymns? Well, folks, I tried. I really did. My plan was for this review to come out this weekend, but after so many listens through this album, trying to like it, I just get nothing from this album. I'm not saying that there aren't distinctive elements or pieces that might stand out a little bit, but at the end of the day, there's not a single song here that I find strong enough to anchor this album or make it worth more re-listens. And that's such a damn shame coming from the group that once made one of the best albums of the last decade, and yet now to have seemed completely misunderstood all of their strengths for this album. And that's the real disappointment. Now, to explain all of that, we need to focus on what made Bloc Party work in the first place, and I can sum it up in one word: tightness. The guitars had a choppy, anxious energy, the bass had enough pulsating texture in order to support that, and the drumming had enough nervous energy and cracking power in order to drive it all home. It sounded fantastic. Sure, there were atmospheric synth effects and dense vocal mixes, but they operated in service of the grooves and the momentum rather than the other way around. And if you want to look at the first crippling blow that hits Bloc Party on Hymns, it's this. The tightness completely is gone. It's the most immediately noticeable in the drumming. Even when Bloc Party were at their most electronic on Intimacy, at least they gave Matt Tong progressions that had some cracking intensity and were produced as such. Louise Bartle does what she can with some pretty sparse arrangements, but the production seems to treat it as perfunctory. Her drum work by smoothing away any cracking power. The production really isn't all that good. And it's even worse for the bass lines when you can hear them at all, which takes away from that underlying foundation that the keyboards and the guitars desperately needed. Of course, in the latter case, when the guitars show up at all. Sure, we occasionally get a decent bass line, like on the verses of The Good News that tries to go into Southern gospel without any real grasp of texture or grit, but much more this record prefers empty, pseudo-atmospheric songs like the very muted So Real or Fortress, when the blubbery organ-like synths are piled on top of everything like the lead-off single Love Within or on Virtue. And why anyone would think that jarringly staccato organ tone sounds better than an actual bass line or guitar riff that you can only see snippets of, or on interludes like Only He Can Heal Me, or shoved to the background on Different Drugs, I have no idea. But the underlying idea behind it all comes through in one of the few actual indie rock songs on this album. A drippy, pseudo mid-2000s R&B tune, Into the Earth, that reeks of the bad acoustic stuff that Bloc Party used to blow off the stage, but now salutes with the following lyric: "'Cause rock and roll has got so old, just give me neo-soul." Now I could go on about how soul has better grooves than this, but Bloc Party's pulling more from gospel on this album anyway. Not gospel that has punch or dramatic swell or bombast or texture, with the closest maybe coming on The Good News or maybe My True Name. I mean, it's not even a surprise surprised that Matt Tong went to Algiers, that this was the sort of gospel that Kelly wanted to make. So slow and limp that I just completely lose interest mid-song, especially considering how clumsy the atmosphere feels layered. As I said, the production isn't very good here. And make no mistake, I'm singling out Kelly for this issue. Not just as the primary lyricist, but also because this music just doesn't work for his vocal style at all. His yelping tones have never been all that perfect, but that's one of the reasons why they work so well against the urgency of Silent Alarm. This material is much smoother and places him much more front and center, and man, either the multi-tracking and harmonies need to be amped up, or Kelly just isn't nearly as good as he thinks he is against this production. Fortress, prime example how he just slips off key, and Living Luck shows him not even trying to stay on the rhythm, but the most grating he gets is on Into the Earth, where his mugging, half-spoken verses trying to sound sexy don't remotely work for me, especially considering how sterile and gutless the instrumentation was on that song. Just did not work at all. But now, we've got to talk about the lyrics, and the one place where this album comes close to being interesting, an attempt to infuse religious iconography and concepts into the foundation of relationships. Now, I'll definitely question how smart that is, idolizing and projecting onto one's partner in that way, but the album does know that, and does manage to give some songs a hint more drama than you would otherwise expect. And plus, there's an underlying core to the idea that love and faith can inspire similar sorts of emotions. But where this album actually gets interesting is in the inversion of how when the relationship inevitably falls apart, and our narrator tries to go for God for answers, God doesn't exactly fulfill as expected. Religion doesn't really work. That void isn't filled in the same way. And tracks like The Good News and Virtue at least try to pose that question and deal with the aftermath, even if the clumsy, ham-fisted writing doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance. And while I'm not exactly wild about either of the final two songs, X's and Living Lux, they at least try to capture a guy sending out a half-hearted apology to those he's hurt in the past, and returning some vestige of normality to make up for things with an old partner. It feels clumsy, desperate, and honestly a little bit pathetic, and yet, if the instrumentation was better, I'd say they were the best parts of the album because they feel the most human and fully realized. And yet at this point, I feel like Bloc Party spent the last of the momentum and good grace that Silent Alarm gave them 10 years ago, with this being the listless, tedious, and underwhelming swan song to drive it all home. I mean, there are ideas here that with a little bit more grit and texture and some of the production or vocal delivery, or the real foundation, could have delivered something with soul or power, but even if that, the writing would still feel half-formed and the album would still run longer than it really should. For me, it's a light 5 out of 10, and only a recommendation if you're a hardcore fan. But you know what? If these are the hymns that Bloc Party are singing, these prayers probably will go unanswered. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. You'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, and I've got quite a considerable list right now, so don't pile on too much, I will be more than happy to give them a listen. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.